All right, joining me now here on the Matthew Filipowicz Show is Rebecca Burns. Rebecca is a reporter and assistant editor for In These Times magazine, which you can find at inthesetimes.com. You can also follow her on Twitter at REJBurns. Rebecca, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thanks for having me, Matt.
All right, so Rebecca, you recently wrote a couple of really, really great articles on the disturbing trend of colleges and universities using adjunct professors. If listeners aren't familiar, let's begin by describing what exactly is an adjunct professor.
Right. So adjuncts are essentially the low-paid temps, or some have said even the indentured servants of the academic workforce. They generally teach on a contract basis, so they're picking up courses semester to semester. Typically, they also don't have health or retirement benefits. And a recent survey shows that nationwide, adjunct professors make an average of $21,000 annually, and that's without benefits. What's particularly disturbing, as you noted, is their growing use. So they now make up as much as 3/4 of the teaching force in higher education. So really the upshot of this is that whereas we might have once thought of higher education as sort of a bastion of good jobs, it's now overwhelmingly made up of sort of these low-paid, precarious professors.
What's really disturbing about that is like the amount of education that someone actually has to get to be a professor. Especially if you're going to get like your PhD, we're talking a decade of education to actually become a professor, and it's one of those things like you're spending that much time in school. Very likely you're going to have gigantic college loans that you're going to have to pay off, unless you're lucky and you get you somehow get a bunch of scholarships and stuff like that. But again, you have all these people who are coming out of this with a ton of debt, and they're not even getting paid enough to actually to live, much less pay off the gigantic loans they have.
Right. I think sort of the big picture here is that, the idea that higher education is really a pathway to prosperity is sort of one of the axioms of our economy in the U.S. And we see that particularly with this example of people who are going into the higher education teaching force, that's no longer true. So in the course of interviewing adjuncts who are considering unionizing, I've talked to people who teach 3 different Composition 101 courses and are grading hundreds of papers that they, are reading through 30-year-old pairs of glasses that they can't afford to replace. Because they're often also strung between, different university campuses, miles and miles apart. People who spend so much on childcare that they're almost not breaking even. So there are a lot of stories that sort of don't jive with the traditional idea of what we would expect for highly educated professionals, but that are really sort of increasingly the norm now in the higher education workforce.
And you mentioned some of the perils of being an adjunct, be it the fact that they don't have some protections. One of the things you actually write about is low wage workers actually have some additional benefits, things like overtime pay that these adjuncts don't actually have.
Right. So I think that's one of the interesting examples of sort of this changing status of what it means to be a professional. Where, certainly being a low-wage worker in the United States means very, very few labor protections and protections on the jobs. But in many cases, by virtue of their status as professionals, adjunct professors are excluded from minimum wage and overtime protections in most federal and state laws. They often have trouble getting access to unemployment assurance because, they're denied sometimes on the rationale that they should have some reasonable assurance of continued work from semester to semester, which sort of definitionally they don't have. So I'd certainly say that this is indicative again of sort of the changing meaning of, what you can expect as a professional, that it's no longer sort of a guaranteed claim to stable living or working conditions.
Yeah, and also you actually wrote in the piece that there was a lawsuit in Washington State where a judge actually ruled that because of the way the adjunct's contract is written out, they actually are not eligible for overtime pay. So this isn't just the way the university is structuring this. This is actually a judge has actually struck down the idea of actually getting overtime for what these adjuncts are doing.
Right. So generally, professionals are excluded from the Fair Labor Standards Act, which is sort of the baseline for minimum wage and overtime protections. So when a group of adjuncts in Washington state tried to petition to be eligible to get overtime, sort of under the rationale that, they did have contracts, but the amount of work that they were expected to do far exceeded what they could expected to be compensated for. As you mentioned, a judge did strike that down, saying that as professionals, they should have a degree of control over their working conditions and hours, which again is sort of exactly what adjuncts no longer do have. So you see adjunct advocates saying that this idea that adjuncts are sort of autonomous professionals is sort of an anachronous one now.
Yeah, especially considering, I think you write that the average salary for adjuncts is $21,600. That for someone who's gone through, probably 10 years of college to only make $21,000, that is a very, very small amount of money.
Exactly. And I think something that I noted is that a lot of times when we see this sort of downward mobility of professionals being discussed, it's written about as though it's sort of droll, it's funny. One New York Times article that I read on the trend of adjuncts going overseas during the summer to seek additional coursework called them seasonal workers with PhDs, as those was sort of cute. But sort of, again, the big picture is that we see that these, low-wage workers within academic institutions, increasingly their working conditions do look more like those of other low-wage workers than perhaps tenured faculty in their own institutions.